When you undock, this is going to be what you're going to see. The standard UI of your mids, lows, and highs. You're not going to see the fighter control UI. So in order to get that, there's a button right here you need to click, and it'll toggle the display to the fighter UI. Now I don't like the toggle, it just doesn't work all that well for me, so I'm going to detach it. And just a word of warning, the first time I detached it, the UI was over here, up on the top left, and I could not get to the button. So in order to get to the button, I had to turn auto hide on for the Neocon, and then move this out. This video is going to be about loading and unloading various fighters in and out of your tubes. If you notice, I don't have any fighters loaded. So the most basic way of loading fighters is to open your fighter bay. From here, you can just simply drag and drop fighters into each tube, and it will take a while to load each individual fighter into the squadron. Then you'll be able to use them once they're done loading. You will notice one small section up here on the top left. This indicates that for this particular ship, I can only have at any given time a maximum of 3 light fighter squadrons and 1 light support squadron. So this means if I unload these two and I try to load another support fighter, I'll get an error. One thing always to be cautious about is to always stack your fighters when you have an opportunity. Fighters will no longer carry the damage that they receive in battle to the hangar or the bay. They will be repaired once they are brought back into the tubes, and then from there you can deposit them into the bay. The reason why you want to stack them will be apparent in a second. So that covers loading and unloading into the tubes here. If you want to unload and load from the fighter control UI, you can right click and unload. And then simply right click again and you'll get a list of the fighters that you have in your bay. As an example of the previous, I have one Templar that has been destroyed and another one has been damaged. You will notice that the fighter is regenerating its health. It will do this over time, but it is rather slow. So let's go ahead and recall this fighter. It will then repair, this little status indicator that's going around in a circle. So that means you now have 8 fully undamaged fighters, and you can pull those out. Now when you go in to load another one through this menu, you'll notice that this Templar squadron of 8 has been unloaded into its own stack. This creates a problem again for when you are reloading this squadron into the tubes, and you'll notice that it's going to reload each one individually. And it stops at 8, the stack that, or the fighters that you pulled out of the tubes just a bit ago. There is no option to add another fighter. To do this, you have to go in, select a fighter, and drag another fighter on top of the UI. It's going to be about basic control and maybe some things to watch out for on the current CC test iteration, just to make sure you know what's going on. So when you're selecting fighters in any given situation, you'll see a blue ring around them. That usually means that whatever action you're telling the game to do, it will only perform it with that entity. You can also select the carrier by clicking on the capacitor, and you'll notice this blue circle. So right now there's no fighters out, and I have my carrier selected, so I can right click and approach any entity on this grid or approach a aligned to an asteroid belt or whatever. When I launch the fighters, you'll notice that it highlights them on the control UI, but it does not highlight them in space. This is just one of those nuances that you'll have to be ready for when this change goes live. If I were to right-click approach it this time, you'll see that since my carrier is selected and the fighters, that everything, including my carrier, will start moving toward that object. So just be sure that you know what is selected so that when you're performing actions, things will turn out the way you want them to. One thing to note here is that your fighters will not warp with you. So if I was to right-click on this asteroid belt and click warp, your fighters will essentially go dormant and the carrier will warp. Now those fighters will stay in that belt and continue getting shot until I recall them when I'm on the other grid. As you can see, I'm not getting any status updates as far as how many are still alive or how much damage one of them had taken. The only way I've figured out how to recall fighters on another grid is to recall them to the launch tubes. Once you do that, they should activate warp from the other grid as long as they are not warp scrambled or disrupted and come back to this grid. It should land at 0 on top of you. You'll notice that now the statuses are going to update, and this one, instead of 30% damaged, is 57% damage. It should also be important to note that while you're in warp, you can manage your fighters. It's going to be about some basic fighter movement. So we're going to go ahead and launch our drones. Now, since the UI is kind of a little bit buggy when you first launch the drones, it seems to highlight everything but not highlight them in the field. So we're going to just go ahead and toggle all of these to select them all. So I'm just going to click one and shift click the last. If you want to move, what you're going to do is hold the Q key when you have the fighter selected that you want to move. This is going to give a ring which essentially shows the distance from the current position on a single plane. When you get to the desired distance, you're going to then left click, and at that point you're going to be able to let go of the Q key, and then you're going to be able to move the indicator up or down so that you can move your fighters in 3D space. If you're familiar with Homeworld, this will be a rather familiar process. These blue lines indicate that the fighters are moving to a specific location. You can select something else and they will still continue to show. Blue means just movement. If they were red, that means that they're going to attack whatever target they are locked onto. You'll notice that the attack fighters are the only ones that have a red line. That is because they are the only ones that have the weapon system with the range to engage. They won't do any damage at 100k, but they will still start firing. Once you get close enough, you can activate the other weapon systems and the E-War system. If they aren't close enough, or you need to get your fighters somewhere quickly, you can always hit the micro warp drive button. An important thing to note when you're dealing with the camera and moving. You'll notice that I have my fighters selected here, and if I want to move while the camera is attached to my carrier, you will get the distance circle centered on the carrier. Now, I think this is a UI bug, and I've reported such because you're not actually moving your carrier, you're moving your group of fighters. So in order to get that to show up properly, you can hold down the right mouse button and pan the camera while you're in the tactical camera mode. Then when you decide to move one of the fighters, you can see the circle then centers on the fighter or object you are trying to move. One other important thing is let's say that you have fighters out and you want to move your carrier only. Be sure that you are selecting your carrier only and not any of the fighters, and then approach or move whatever direction you want to. In this way, the ship will be controllable as it is currently in game. You can double click in space, right click to objects, select them, approach them, etc., etc. But again, if you want to just move your fighters and not your carrier, so say for instance you don't move out of refit range, you'll need to ensure that you are selecting fighter groups and not your carrier. This will be about basic combat with your fighters. There won't be anything special in this one, just going to shoot some rats here. So if you want to have your fighters move and attack a specific target, obviously you're going to have to lock it and make sure that the fighters are selected to attack the target. I don't know if fighter bombers are this way, but I suspect they are. But only attack fighters of the attack, space superiority, and support fighters have weapons that will fire at any range as long as the target is locked. This means that you can click on and activate their standard weapon, and then that fighter group will fly to whatever target you selected. You can do the same with the others, but if they are not in range or optimal range of the module, it will not activate and it will just fly to get within range. This means that you will have to pay attention to your fighters and make sure that when your support fighters show up in range of the target, you have to activate the module. One last thing I just wanted to touch on is the difference between and the power of the various fighters as far as the light fighters go. The Equite, or Equite, however the hell you pronounce it, is a space superiority fighter. That means it is designed solely for taking out other fighters and drones. The Templar is your standard go-to light fighter that is good for taking out subcaps and dealing some decent damage to capitals. You will notice that the maximum velocity for the space superiority fighters is greater than the Templar. So, the Templars cannot outpace the Equites. However, one of their abilities is a micro warp drive. The Equite does not have a micro warp drive. What it has is something called evasive maneuvers, which gives it a small boost to its speed and resistances. The duration of the MWD is twice as long as the duration of evasive maneuvers and has the same cooldown. You'll also notice that one of the abilities for the Equite is this, or tackle. The tackle is essentially a scrambler for other fighters. It will not work or activate on anything else but fighters and drones. Has a decent range. The most important part is that it not only shuts off your micro warp drive for your light fighters, but it disables your MJD for heavy fighters. It also, per fighter left in the squadron, reduces the speed of the tackled fighter by 6% per drone. This is incredibly important and incredibly powerful. These things will work the shit out of fighters. They will also kill heavy fighters quite efficiently. So you need to make sure that you are managing your fighters, watching the battlefield, and ensuring that you're not getting swarmed by space superiority fighters, because you will lose your fighters very fast. This is probably one of the reasons why it's going to be very difficult to multi-box. Just as an example, I've sent off 2 Templar squadrons and 1 Equite squadron. I'm going to recall the Templar squadrons and just show you how fast these Equites will kill an attack fighter. You'll notice that the speed, not only will it shut off the MWDs, but it also drops the speed to under 400 ms. We are already working on the second drone here. It is approximately 4 volleys per fighter to kill them. There is nothing that a Templar can do to a space superiority fighter. In fact, I will show you here. You'll notice a very, very weak damage. There's almost no damage coming from these. And if damage gets too high on the Equites, they can just hit the evasive maneuvers, which speeds them up, thus reducing the application of the rocket salvo, as well as increased resistances. There is just no contest. If these space superiority fighters get on your heavy bombers or your attack fighters, they will die, and there is nothing they can do to defend themselves. You can see the Templar squadron is just about half dead now, and only 1 of the fighters in the Equite squadron is at half. Oh, and last thing to add for you kill mail horrors, you actually do get kill mail reports for each fighter you kill. Hooray! But again, I just want to drive home how powerful these anti-fighter squadrons are, these space superiority fighters. If you're going to drop supers, if you're going to drop a single super on a carrier that has a bunch of these space superiority fighters, you may not be able to kill them. They may neuter you and bring their friends in, and there would be nothing you can do about it. Be careful and make sure that you take support carriers with you. I believe that is part of the design around carriers and supers, is that super carriers are going to be dependent upon carriers to provide support, and I also think that's a good change.